In the 17th and 18th centuries, early American settlers relied heavily on their ingenuity and the natural resources available to them. The construction of wooden homes was a reflection of their adaptation to the environment, as nails were scarce and expensive. Instead, they utilized a variety of joinery techniques that allowed them to connect wooden beams and planks securely. Mortise and tenon joints, for example, are one of the oldest forms of woodworking joints. When the first settlers arrived on the shores of early America, they were met not by towns or trails, but by an overwhelming vastness of trees. The land seemed to stretch endlessly, an unbroken green ocean that rolled from the coast to the horizon. There were no roads, no fences, no sound of carts or bells, only the constant murmur of wind through the forest canopy, the rustle of leaves that moved like waves, and the steady hum of insects filling the air. For those who had come from the structured villages of Europe, the silence of this wilderness was both beautiful and unnerving. The settlers had read of the New World as a place of promise, fertile, open, waiting. But the truth was something else entirely. It was not open at all. The forest closed around them like a living wall. In every direction they turned, there were trees, towering pines and oaks, chestnuts and maples that blocked out the sky. The ground beneath their boots was soft with centuries of fallen leaves, damp and rich with decay. Each step sank slightly into the earth, and the air smelled of moss, bark, and the deep, unending scent of green. For many of them, it was difficult not to feel small. The forest made even the strongest men feel like intruders in someone else's home. They could not yet see it as a resource or an ally. At first, it was simply an obstacle. The trees stood too close together to build, too thick to farm, too dark to travel through safely. Yet in time, they would come to realize that these same trees held the key to everything they needed: shelter, heat, and survival. Before they could build, they had to understand the land itself. It was not like the countryside of England or France, where woodlands had already been tamed by centuries of human hands. Here, the forest was wild, untouched since creation. The settlers learned quickly that not all trees were the same. The tall, straight trunks of white pine were strong but easy to work with. Oak was dense and enduring, but heavy to cut. Hickory bent before breaking and made fine handles for tools. Cedar resisted rot and kept away insects. Every type of wood carried its own lesson, and learning those lessons was the difference between success and failure. The first task was clearing space, a patch of ground large enough to imagine a home upon. It was back-breaking labor. With no sawmills nearby, they relied entirely on the axe. Each swing had to count. The blade would bite deep into the bark, sending up a spray of white chips that scattered across the forest floor. The rhythm of chopping soon became the rhythm of life. The rise and fall of iron against wood, the crash of trees as they gave way, the hollow echo that rolled out across the clearing. When the first trees finally fell, there was both triumph and fear. Cutting down a single oak could take the better part of a day, and when it came down with terrible force, many men were injured by the very thing they sought to master. But when the crash faded, what remained was an opening, a space where sunlight could reach the ground for the first time in perhaps 100 years. That light became a kind of blessing. It meant progress. It meant hope. In those early settlements, there were no carpenters in the modern sense, only people willing to learn. Most of them had never built a house before, let alone one without nails. But the forest was generous to those who were patient. They soon discovered that wood, unlike stone, was alive even after being cut. It bent and flexed. It swelled in the rain and shrank in the dry wind. A home made from such material could not be forced together by iron. It had to be persuaded, shaped, and balanced. The settlers began by rolling the felled logs toward the center of the clearing, stripping away branches with small axes called hatchets. They learned to flatten two sides of each log so that when stacked, they would fit snugly against one another. It was crude at first, and the gaps between logs were filled with whatever came to hand: clay, mud, straw, even moss gathered from the nearby stones. They called this mixture chinking, and though it looked rough, it sealed out much of the wind and rain. Days were long and nights came cold. When they paused to rest, they often stared at the incomplete walls rising before them and wondered if they would hold through winter. The forest was full of sounds at night, the calls of owls, the soft cracking of wood in the cold, and the distant cry of wolves. Yet amid that darkness, there was also peace. The settlers knew that every log they placed, every groove they carved, was a step closer to belonging. It was common for several families to work together, forming small communities bound by necessity. They helped one another raise the first beams, each person contributing strength where it was needed. In this cooperation, something profound began to form, a quiet sense of unity. They came to see that their survival depended not just on individual endurance, but on shared effort. Building without nails required more than tools. It required trust. Every log had to fit precisely against its neighbor, and every joint had to bear weight evenly. If one part failed, the whole structure could fall. Over time, they began to look at the forest differently. It was no longer an enemy to be conquered, but a companion to be understood. They started to notice the subtle hues of bark, the scent that told whether a tree was dry enough to fell, the way light changed when the leaves thinned in autumn. They came to appreciate the patience of trees, how they grew slowly, silently, reaching toward the light year after year. The settlers learned to mirror that patience in their own work. For all its hardships, there was beauty in their struggle. Each morning, mist would rise from the ground, catching the sunlight and turning the clearing into a silver dream. The smell of fresh-cut pine filled the air, sweet and sharp. Children played among the chips and shavings while their parents worked, their laughter echoing through the valley. The sound of axes became the heartbeat of the settlement, a rhythm that promised permanence. As weeks passed, the weather began to change. The soft greens of spring gave way to the golden light of summer. The forest hummed with insects, and the air grew heavy with the scent of sap and earth. Sweat darkened shirts and soaked through gloves. Tools grew dull from use and had to be sharpened over the evening fire, sparks dancing upward into the deepening dusk. Even as exhaustion set in, the settlers found a strange peace in repetition. The swing of the axe, the roll of the logs, the thud of timber meeting timber. Each motion carried the weight of purpose. By late summer, the first walls were waist-high, then shoulder-high, and soon taller than a man. The rough openings left for doors and windows framed pieces of the forest like paintings. Through them, they could see deer passing in the distance or watch the slow drift of clouds above. These glimpses reminded them that, for all their labor, they were still guests in a land that had existed long before them and would endure long after. Autumn arrived quietly. One morning the forest was green, and the next it burned with color. Flaming orange, deep crimson, amber gold. Leaves fell in soft spirals that carpeted the clearing, and each gust of wind carried a cool promise of winter. The settlers hurried now, knowing the first snow might come early. Their hands were blistered, their backs sore, but they worked until the light failed, driven by the knowledge that a roof must be raised before frost set in. The nights grew longer. Fires flickered brighter against the growing dark, and the forest changed its voice. Where once it had rustled with life, now it creaked and sighed, settling into its long sleep. Wolves howled more often from the ridges, their calls echoing across the valley like a reminder of how fragile these new beginnings were. Yet the settlers felt something shift inside them. Fear gave way to familiarity. The cries of the night were no longer threats, but background, sounds of a world they were learning to live within. When the first frost finally came, the cabins stood waiting, their corners locked together through careful joinery, their roofs sealed with bark and shingles split by hand. Smoke began to curl from rough-built chimneys, rising into the pale sky. Inside, the walls smelled of resin and warmth. A single candle might cast a golden circle on the log surfaces, revealing the marks of every tool and the memory of every hand that had worked there. For the first time, families slept under roofs they had built themselves. The wind pressed gently against the outer walls, but the structures held firm. The wood groaned softly, expanding and settling, but it did not give way. The settlers listened to these sounds the way one listens to the breathing of a newborn child, anxious, protective, amazed. Their homes were alive in their own quiet way. It was a strange paradox. These houses were primitive in design, yet deeply sophisticated in spirit. They embodied resilience, adaptation, and quiet understanding. They were born from a conversation between human hands and nature's patience. And though the settlers may not have realized it then, they were laying the foundation not just for homes, but for a culture, one that prized self-reliance, craftsmanship, and endurance. When evening came and fires flickered behind new walls, the sound of the forest softened. The endless trees no longer seemed threatening. Their silhouettes against the fading light looked like guardians watching over what had been built. The settlers sat near the doorways of their log cabins, listening to the night wind slide through branches, and for the first time, they felt safe. In the morning, when the sun rose and shone across the clearing, the cabins caught the light in a way that made them seem almost golden. They stood firm, unpolished, but proud, a testament to human perseverance. There were no nails, no iron braces, no ornate designs. Only wood, shaped by patience and held together by belief. And so, in this land of endless trees, the first homes of America were born. They were not monuments of power or wealth, but quiet declarations of survival, proof that even in the vast silence of the unknown, people could create something that would last. The forest, once empty and infinite, had become a home. As the first winter passed, the settlers began to understand something remarkable. The forest was not simply a supply of timber, it was a living library of wisdom. The longer they worked with it, the more they realized that wood had a language of its own. It spoke softly, without words, through the curve of its grain, the scent of its heartwood, and the sound it made beneath an axe. For those who learned to listen, every log, branch, and beam could tell a story. At first, the newcomers treated trees as obstacles, heavy, immovable things that stood in the way of survival. By the second season, however, their perception began to change. They discovered that the forest, once an adversary, could be a teacher. Some mornings, they walked among the trunks before beginning their work, running their hands across rough bark, noting which trees stood tall and true and which leaned gently toward the light. They came to see that each tree carried its own character, as distinct as any person. Some grew proud and straight, while others twisted and weathered, shaped by storms and years of wind. The more they worked, the more they began to feel the difference. When an axe struck green wood, it gave a dull, heavy sound, and the blade stuck fast. Dry wood, by contrast, answered with a sharp, clean crack. Pine gave off a faint sweetness as it split. Oak smelled darker and deeper, almost bitter. Hickory rang with an echo that traveled across the clearing like a song. These small things mattered. They became clues that guided the builder's choices, which tree to fell for beams, which to save for tool handles, and which to use for fire. Wood could not be hurried. If cut too young, it warped and split. If left too long after felling, it invited rot. Every log had a moment, a perfect balance between strength and flexibility, and finding that moment required patience. Some settlers began to say that wood was like a companion. It responded best to kindness and care. Those who rushed, who forced it into shape, found their homes creaking and shifting with the seasons. Those who worked with it gently, who respected its rhythm, saw cabins endure through storms and hard winters. They also learned to read the tree's life in its rings, wide bands that spoke of generous summers and narrow lines that whispered of drought and hardship. The oldest specimens bore dense, dark cores and tight growth rings. Timber that once milled and dried could carry weight for decades. When such wood became a beam, it carried memory as well as load. It was as if the house contained chapters of the forest's own life. Among the settlers, a few became something more than builders. They became listeners. These men and women could glance at a trunk and know how it would split, how it would dry, how it would bear weight. They discovered that wood behaved differently in sunlight and shade, that sapwood dried faster than heartwood, and that the tree's position on a slope could affect its grain. They taught apprentices how to strike an axe so that it followed the grain rather than fighting it, how to shave a tenon until it fit like a key in a lock, and how to season a plank so that it would remain true. Their tools reflected this deeper understanding. The axe became less an instrument of violence and more a fine instrument of shaping. The chisel became a translator, carefully revealing the hidden pattern beneath bark. The adze, with its curved blade, flattened and smoothed log faces as though the craftsmen were coaxing a story into view. Saws were used with a slow, patient rhythm. A hurried saw left splinters and weakened edges. In their hands, tools gained intentionality. Each movement was measured, each cut considered. As the settlers grew more skilled, their buildings grew more refined. The first generation of cabins had been blunt and hasty. The next showed thought. Logs hewn so their faces matched, joints cut with care. They learned notches and locks that allowed logs to interlace and tighten as they settled under load. The saddle notch, a simple curve carved to let one log sit securely upon another, became a common solution. The dovetail notch, more complex, created a mechanical lock that would draw the corner tighter as the weight increased. Such joinery required discipline. Measuring, marking, remeasuring, and a steady hand. There was artistry in these solutions. A perfectly cut dovetail was elegant, a harmony of angles and forces. These corners were not just structural. They were gestures, small human marks against the infinite geometry of the forest. Builders would sometimes sign their work with a carved initial, a simple flower, or a shallow bowl marking where grains intersected most beautifully. These signatures were quiet acts of pride, reminders that the house had been made by human intention as much as by the forest's bounty. The settlers also borrowed knowledge wherever they could find it. Indigenous peoples of the continent had long relationships with these woods, with techniques and rituals shaped by centuries of practice. In many regions, Native American methods for splitting wood, fashioning beams, and using bark or reed thatch informed settler practices. The settlers learned to respect techniques that had been refined over generations, how to remove bark in strips without damaging inner fibers, how to cure certain woods with smoke to resist insects, and how to weave thin wooden shingles for flexible roofing. These exchanges were not universal, and interaction varied by place and circumstance. But where knowledge passed between peoples, it often saved lives and improved shelter. Beyond technique, wood taught larger lessons about life. It taught patience because trees grow slowly and so must good craft. It taught humility because the material would not be forced into lasting shape. And it taught a kind of reciprocity because the more carefully wood was tended, the more faithfully it would serve. A house built with thought and respect returned warmth and shelter without complaint. A house forced into being quickly showed its flaws in the first hard season. Daily life among wood left an imprint on people's manners and language. They developed sayings about wood that carried broader moral meanings. To mind your grain became an admonition to respect someone's nature. To settle into the notch meant to find one's proper place within a community. The physical vocabulary of the workshop, tenon, mortise, notch, scarf, folded into everyday speech until building and living were described in the same terms. Children grew up with wood as constant companion. Small hands learned to carry kindling, to tap a plank and judge its sound, to run a finger along a joint and feel its fit. These simple acts passed skills from one generation to the next, in a quiet, unhurried way. A child who carved his first spoon from a scrap of hickory later became a man who could lay a beam that would not bend under snow. Knowledge accumulated not in books, but in the muscle memory of hands and in the patient repetition of seasons. Through it all, the settlers developed a deep aesthetic sense born from necessity and beauty. They learned to enjoy the way the sun fell across a polished plank, the richness of an oiled beam, the way a carved pattern caught shadow and light. Their homes, while spare, bore a restrained elegance, practical because every feature had a purpose, beautiful because that purpose was executed with care. At night, when the village slept and the trees stood like dark sentinels beyond the wavering ring of lamplight, the houses themselves seemed to carry the voices of the forest inside them. Boards creaked as they contracted in the cool air. Shingles sighed under the weight of rain, and the hearth's glow threw warm ovals that highlighted the grain of each log. The soundscape of living among wood was rich and intimate. It reminded people that their houses were not mere shelters, but companions that changed and aged alongside them. By the third year, the settlement had grown steadier. The cabins were straighter, the corners truer, and the rhythm of life more humane. A kind of quiet dignity took root, a recognition that their place in the world was earned by careful work, by listening to the living material around them, and by agreeing to live within its rules. Wood had taught them more than building. It had taught them a way to be in the world, patient, observant, and respectful. And so the language of wood became a foundation not merely for houses, but for an idea about how to live. The settlers' homes, carved from the forest and held together by careful joinery rather than metal, embodied a promise that people could create lasting shelter by attending to the character of the material before them, by learning its grammar, and by answering in kind. In that answering, the first permanent traces of a new society began to form. Quiet, deliberate, and rooted in the slow, wise grammar of trees. When historians look back at the early settlers of America, they often speak of courage, endurance, or faith. Yet behind all those grand virtues stood something humble and tangible, the tools they carried. A single axe, a simple chisel, or a hand-forged adze often meant the difference between failure and survival. These were not just implements of labor. They were companions, almost sacred objects, that shaped both the wooden homes they built and the lives they lived. For many settlers, their journey began with a single chest of belongings. Some clothes, a Bible, a pot or two, and perhaps a small bundle of tools wrapped in oiled cloth. Inside that bundle lay the future, the few pieces of iron that could carve civilization out of wilderness. The axe was always first. Heavy, solid, its edge glinting faintly in the dawn, it was both weapon and lifeline. In its reflection, a settler could almost see his own determination staring back. The first time a man swung that axe into an untouched tree, it was an act filled with uncertainty. He could not know if his strength would be enough, if the metal would hold, or if his arm would endure the repetition. The sound that followed, the clean thud of iron meeting wood, was the first true declaration of intent in the new world. It was not a shout or a prayer, but a rhythm, the rhythm of work, the rhythm of hope. In those early days, an axe was far more than a tool. It was identity. Men measured one another by the sharpness of their blades and the precision of their strikes. A good woodsman could fell a tree in half the time of a novice. But skill came at a price. The untrained swung wildly and tired quickly, wasting energy on blows that barely cut the bark. The experienced learned to let the weight of the axe do the work. They found a rhythm, a kind of music in the forest, the sound of deliberate, patient progress. Settlers treated their axes with reverence. When the day's labor ended, they wiped the blade with oil and wrapped it in cloth to keep away moisture. Rust was more than a blemish. It was a threat to survival. Each axe was hand-forged, often irreplaceable. If it broke, there might not be another for months, perhaps years. Some even gave their tools names, as though they were living companions. There was affection in the way they spoke of them, as if the axe itself shared in the labor and the dreams it made possible. But the axe was only the beginning. After trees fell and were cut to length, other tools took their place, quieter, subtler, each designed for a specific conversation with wood. The adze, for instance, looked simple. A curved blade mounted perpendicular to a wooden handle. Yet in skilled hands, it could shape beams smoother than any saw. The craftsman stood upon the log, raising and dropping the adze in a steady rhythm, chips flying like pale petals around his boots. Each stroke flattened the surface, turning a rough log into a squared timber ready for building. The sound of an adze at work, a hollow thump, followed by the whisper of falling shavings, carried far through the still air. The adze demanded precision. A careless movement could gouge too deeply, ruining a beam that had taken days to fell and prepare. Many settlers bore scars on their shins from early mistakes, yet they persisted, driven by necessity and the satisfaction of mastery. Over time, they learned to read the wood beneath their feet, to feel through the vibration of each strike how close they were to the grain's heart. The adze became not merely a tool, but an extension of the builder's own sense of balance. Then came the chisel, perhaps the most modest of all their instruments, but also the most eloquent. In that small wedge of steel lay precision, patience, and artistry. The chisel did not shout. It whispered. It allowed for detail. The carving of joints, the smoothing of corners, the crafting of pegs that would hold without nails. With a chisel and a mallet, a builder could coax two pieces of wood into perfect union. The sound of its tapping echoed softly across the clearing, like a heartbeat marking time. There was something meditative in this process. While the axe required strength and rhythm, the chisel demanded stillness and focus. It taught gentleness in a world that often demanded brute endurance. Watching a craftsman at work, leaning close, breath steady, eyes tracing the grain, was to witness a kind of conversation between man and material. The line between work and prayer often blurred in those moments. To bore holes for wooden pegs or dowels, the settlers used a tool called an auger, a hand-powered drill made of a spiral iron bit attached to a wooden handle. Turning it required patience as the screw-like edge bit slowly into the grain. The auger had to be kept perfectly straight. A single tilt could ruin a joint. Its progress was marked not by speed, but by the soft crunching of wood fibers and the faint scent of sap rising from the freshly cut spiral. Each hole made by an auger was a promise, a place where two beams would join in trust. None of these tools were disposable. Iron was rare and precious, often imported or traded for at great cost. Every nick, every crack was repaired, every handle replaced with care. The settlers learned to carve new handles from hickory or ash, shaping them by hand until they fit the palm comfortably. In this act of renewal, there was respect, a recognition that these tools, too, bore the marks of time and labor. Over the years, the settlers came to see their tools as a reflection of themselves. A well-kept axe spoke of discipline. A sharp chisel showed patience. A smooth, straight handle revealed the craftsman's humility, for only one who respected the material could make something so perfectly simple. When visitors came from distant settlements, men would sometimes exchange tools briefly, testing their balance, admiring the care that had gone into them. These small gestures were a form of conversation, an unspoken language of shared struggle and achievement. Workshops, though humble, held a quiet sanctity. Inside, the smell of oil, pine resin, and metal blended into a fragrance that became the scent of creation. Shafts of light filtered through the gaps in the walls, illuminating suspended motes of sawdust that sparkled as they drifted. The rhythm of the day inside these spaces was gentle but steady, the rasp of a file sharpening an edge, the soft murmur of a whetstone across a blade, the occasional strike of a hammer aligning a joint. For many settlers, maintaining their tools became a kind of ritual. Sharpening an axe at dusk after a day's labor was not simply maintenance. It was meditation. As the blade glided against the stone, sparks flickered in the fading light, and the rhythmic scraping became a familiar comfort. In that sound, there was both weariness and renewal. Each pass of the stone promised another day of usefulness, another structure to rise, another family to find warmth beneath its roof. Children were often taught early how to handle tools, though not to use them recklessly. Fathers would hand their sons a small hatchet and guide their movements. "Don't fight it," they would say. "Let it work with you." The first lessons were not about strength, but respect. A careless swing could wound more than the wood. By learning to handle the tool gently, the child also learned a kind of discipline, an understanding that every action had consequence. Women, too, took part in the care of tools and the use of smaller implements for shaping, carving, or crafting. Many created wooden utensils, bowls, and handles, their skill no less exacting than that of the builders. In their hands, chisels and knives produced the delicate curves of spoons and ladles, objects that carried both beauty and daily utility. Thus, in each household, the tools became a bridge, connecting survival with artistry, necessity with grace. There was something profoundly hopeful in the way the settlers treated their instruments. Every strike of metal against wood was a small defiance against uncertainty. Each sharpened edge, each polished handle was a statement that they intended to stay, to build, to endure. Tools represented continuity. They were handed down from father to son, from mother to daughter, their handles worn smooth by generations of labor. When a man died, his axe often rested beside him, a silent tribute to a life spent shaping the world. In later years, visitors from Europe would remark that the wooden homes of America had a peculiar warmth to them, a texture of human touch that seemed woven into every beam. Perhaps that warmth came not only from the wood itself, but from the spirit of the tools that shaped it. Every notch, every groove, every beam had been touched by hands guided by care and belief. These homes were, in a sense, living monuments to simple tools and the hope they carried. By the end of the first decade, the settlements no longer looked like fragile footholds. They had matured into communities, villages of wooden houses, barns, and workshops, each built with patience and trust. And though time would eventually bring sawmills and nails, and later, the machines of industry, the spirit of those first-hand tools would never truly disappear. Even as progress arrived with its noise and speed, somewhere in the quiet corners of America, a craftsman would still lift a chisel or an adze and feel the same reverence that the first builders had felt centuries before. Because in truth, those tools were never just pieces of iron. They were the physical expression of faith, faith that human hands, guided by purpose, could create stability in an unpredictable world. They were reminders that the simplest acts of making, cutting, shaping, joining, could hold entire communities together. And as the firelight flickered on the edge of a polished blade, the settlers could almost see the reflection of tomorrow, the promise that from their labor, something lasting and beautiful would rise. That was why they called them tools of hope. For every home that stood without nails, every beam that held without iron, every wall that endured the test of time, had begun with one of these simple, faithful companions, tools that turned the wilderness into a world worth living in. In every early American settlement, there came a moment when the question had to be faced. How do you make wood hold itself together? The trees had been felled, the logs trimmed and smoothed, the beams prepared, and yet one critical ingredient was missing: nails. They were scarce, precious, often imported from distant ports, and far too expensive for common builders. Without them, an entire civilization had to learn to rely on something else: the ancient, patient craft of joinery. To modernize, the simplicity of those wooden structures might seem deceptive. The corners, the beams, the frames appeared almost effortless, as if they had always belonged together. But within those seams lay centuries of learning, a quiet geometry of strength and trust. Each joint, each peg, each carved notch was a handshake between pieces of wood, a small miracle of precision that allowed homes to rise without a single piece of iron. The earliest settlers drew on old traditions. Some had seen similar methods in their homelands, where timber framing had long been practiced. Yet, in America, they had to adapt those techniques to the unfamiliar woods of the new continent. The timber here was different. The white oak tougher, the pine softer and full of sap, the hickory bending before it broke. They had to experiment, to listen, to learn. The guiding principle was simple. Wood could hold wood if treated properly. The trick was to shape the ends of the beams so that they interlocked, each one supporting and being supported by the other. The most common method was the notch, a carved recess cut into one log so that another could rest within it. At its simplest, this was the saddle notch, shaped like a shallow crescent. The curve cradled the log above it, distributing weight evenly. When the house settled under its own mass, the notches pressed tighter, sealing themselves against wind and rain. But there were others who sought perfection, who could not be satisfied with simple strength alone. They developed what became the most elegant of all wooden connections, the dovetail joint. It was a marvel of human thought. Two ends cut into opposing, angled shapes that locked together like clasped fingers. Once fitted, the joint resisted both pulling and twisting. The more weight it bore, the tighter it became. The settlers might not have had the language of engineering, but they understood instinctively that beauty and function were not enemies. They were one and the same. Cutting a dovetail required skill and patience. The builder would measure carefully, marking the wood with charcoal lines, then take up his saw and chisel. The saw did the rough work, carving along the lines with slow, deliberate strokes. The chisel followed, clearing the waste, refining the angle, making the surface smooth. The sound of a mallet tapping gently against a chisel was the quiet heartbeat of every settlement. In that rhythm lay concentration, respect, and hope. When the two pieces finally met, male and female, pin and tail, they fit so perfectly that no light could pass between them. The craftsman would run his fingers along the seam and smile faintly, not from pride, but from relief. He knew that the joint would hold, that the house would stand, that his labor had found its purpose. Beyond the corners, other kinds of joinery held the skeleton of the home together. The mortise and tenon joint was the soul of timber framing. A mortise was a hole, carved deep into one beam. The tenon was a tongue, cut on the end of another, sized precisely to fit the mortise. When the two came together, they formed a bond as strong as iron. Sometimes, a wooden peg, called a trunnel, short for tree nail, was driven through both, locking them in place. These pegs were shaped by hand from oak or ash, dried carefully so that when hammered into the green wood, they would swell, tightening the joint further. The settlers discovered that this method had a remarkable quality. It allowed the building to breathe. Wood expands and contracts with humidity, with the shifting of seasons. Nails, being rigid, eventually loosen. But wooden joints, if cut properly, flexed gently with the rhythm of nature. Their houses were not static machines, but living organisms, built to move with the wind and weather. Watching a frame rise in the center of a clearing was a sight few forgot. The great beams, cut and shaped by hand, were lifted into place by ropes, levers, and the strength of neighbors. The entire community often gathered for what they called a raising, a day when the frame of a barn or house would finally stand upright. It was not only work, but ceremony, filled with laughter, shouts, and the sound of wooden mallets striking home the final pegs. To an outsider, it may have looked chaotic. Men calling to one another, ropes creaking, beams swaying precariously. But to those who knew the rhythm of the craft, it was a dance. Every movement mattered. Every joint had to meet perfectly. Every peg had to strike true. When the last beam was set and the structure stood firm, a cheer would rise, not loud, but genuine, carrying across the valley. For in that moment, they had turned raw timber into architecture, chaos into harmony. And yet, beneath the pride, there was always humility. The builders knew that their work depended on listening to the wood, to its limits, to its quiet instructions. Each species had its own personality. Pine was forgiving, easy to shape, but prone to dent. Oak resisted the blade, but once persuaded, held stronger than any other. Maple offered smooth surfaces for finishing, while chestnut, though beautiful, could split if handled carelessly. The craftsman's task was to respect these differences, to find cooperation rather than dominance. There was a saying among them: "If you force it, it will betray you." Every broken beam, every twisted joint, every collapsed wall came from ignoring that rule. The forest, like life itself, rewarded patience and punished arrogance. In the evenings, after a long day's labor, the builders would sit before the unfinished frame, watching the last light touch the wood. The scent of sap hung in the air, mingling with the smoke from their fires. They would run their hands across the smooth tenons, feeling the faint warmth left by the day's sun, and they would talk quietly of weather, of crops, of the future. They spoke of their homes as if they were living things, and perhaps, in a way, they were. Sometimes, when rain began to fall, the sound of droplets drumming on the new beams filled the air. The men would smile, knowing that even before the roof was finished, the frame already had its first conversation with the elements. They took comfort in that. The idea that nature and human craft could speak to each other through the medium of wood. The next morning, when the rain had passed, they would return to find the beams darker, richer, the grain more pronounced. It was as though the storm had baptized the house, making it ready for life. Each joint that had been shaped by hand now held traces of both effort and time, a partnership between man, tool, and nature. Some builders became so attuned to this partnership that they could predict how their structures would age. They knew which joints would tighten in winter, which pegs would swell in the humid summer air, which beams would creak softly as the building settled. These small movements did not trouble them. A wooden house, after all, was meant to live. The creaking was not a sign of weakness, but of breath, the building exhaling, expanding, shifting gently against the earth. For those who slept inside, these sounds became familiar, even comforting. The home spoke to them in the language of wood and wind. At night, as the fire died low, one could hear the faint sigh of the walls, a sound that seemed to say, "I am holding. You are safe." Over time, joinery evolved into an art that defined early American identity. It was craftsmanship at its purest, unadorned yet profound. A house built this way was not merely a shelter, it was a declaration of principle. It said that human beings could endure without excess, that intelligence and patience could replace abundance, and that understanding was stronger than iron. Centuries later, when archaeologists unearthed remnants of these early buildings, they found that many joints still held firm. The pegs, though weathered, remained tight. The mortises and tenons, cut by hand long before machines existed, fit together as if time itself respected their precision. There was poetry in that endurance, a silent testament to a craft built on humility and care. And if one listens carefully today, in the oldest barns and cabins still standing, one can still hear the soft dialogue of wood. Beams murmuring against the weight they carry, joints creaking like old voices remembering their makers. They continue to hold, not just because of the shape of their cuts, but because of the spirit with which they were made. That was the true art of joinery. Not the elimination of nails, but the discovery that strength could come from understanding. It was the belief that things could last, not by being forced together, but by fitting together. And in that quiet principle lay the essence of early America, a nation built not only on courage and ambition, but on patience, cooperation, and faith in the beauty of honest work. Every home began as a dream, but it became real only when the frame stood tall against the sky. Until that moment, it was all theory. The careful carving of joints, the measuring of beams, the scent of cut pine and oak. But when the skeleton of the house rose from the earth, something changed. The clearing transformed. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. The people who had labored for months could finally see the outline of a future, not imagined, but standing before them in wood and light. The act of raising a frame was more than construction. It was a declaration. We are staying. It meant that the forest was no longer an enemy, the soil no longer a stranger. It meant that people had decided to plant themselves here, to shape permanence from impermanence. In the early American wilderness, few things were more significant. When a family decided to raise their house, word spread quickly. There were no telegraphs or newspapers, but messages traveled fast through word of mouth. Perhaps it was mentioned after church, or over a shared meal, or whispered between neighbors gathering firewood. Within days, everyone knew. "We're raising on Saturday," someone would say, and that was enough. Tools were sharpened, plans made, and hearts quietly prepared for the long day ahead. The morning of the raising always began early, often before dawn. The air was still and damp, filled with the faint sweetness of dew. The builders gathered in small groups, their breath visible in the cool light. Fires burned in iron pots, sending up curls of smoke that mixed with the smell of freshly hewn timber. The beams, broad, heavy, and pale, lay neatly arranged on the ground, their ends carved with mortises and tenons, their surfaces still warm from the hands that shaped them. The builder, usually the head of the family, walked the perimeter slowly, eyes scanning every piece. He would touch the wood with quiet reverence, tracing the grain with calloused fingers, murmuring to himself that everything was ready. Around him, neighbors and friends stood waiting, leaning on axes or holding ropes coiled neatly at their sides. "Today," he would finally say, "we lift her up." And with that, the work began. To raise the frame of a wooden house was no small feat. The structure was built from great assemblies called bents, two upright posts connected by a crossbeam at the top. Each bent was assembled flat on the ground, fitted together by mortise and tenon, pegged loosely to keep its shape. Once ready, it had to be lifted upright, slowly, evenly, and without fail. Ropes were tied to the top of the bent, while long poles called pike poles were placed beneath it, acting as levers. Men took their positions along the ropes, while others steadied the poles. When the command was given, they began to pull. The first moments were always the hardest. The beam was heavy and unyielding, and the ropes creaked under strain. But then, inch by inch, the massive frame began to move. Dust and bark fell from its joints. The sound of straining rope filled the air, and dozens of boots dug into the earth for purchase. The voices of men rose in rhythm, not shouting, but calling steady encouragement. "Hold the line. Keep her straight. Pull again. Slow." Women and children stood at a safe distance, watching with anxious pride. To them, it was a kind of magic. To see what had been flat on the ground rise into the air, slowly becoming the wall of a home. The sunlight caught on the beams as they rose, turning them gold. The smell of sap and sweat filled the clearing. When at last the first bent stood upright, the crowd would cheer. It wasn't the loud cheer of victory, but the deep sigh of relief shared by all. The frame was wedged in place temporarily with angled supports, and attention turned to the next. The process repeated. More pulling, more shouts, more dust, more cautious triumph. By mid-morning, the house began to take shape. The space that had once been an open patch of land now had edges, height, and direction. At noon, the work paused. Tools were set down. The smell of food drifted from the makeshift tables. Bread baked in outdoor ovens, salted pork, cheese, and apples. Tin mugs clinked with cider and water drawn from the nearby stream. Everyone ate together, sitting on logs or the grass. They spoke softly, sometimes laughing, sometimes falling into reflective silence. For a brief moment, the raising felt like a feast rather than labor. Afterward came the hardest part. The roof ridge. This long, heavy beam would tie the structure together, joining the two sides at the very top. It was dangerous work. One slip could destroy the day's effort or worse, cost lives. The air grew tense as preparations began. The ridge beam was carried by hand, a dozen men on each side, stepping carefully over the rough ground. They lifted it onto temporary supports at shoulder height, then attached ropes to guide its ascent. The builder gave a nod, and the men began to haul. The beam rose slowly, swaying in the air like something alive. The ropes tightened and groaned. Commands echoed sharply across the clearing. "Steady! Up a little more. Hold it there!" Sweat ran down faces. Dust rose in small clouds beneath their boots. Then, with one final coordinated push, the ridge beam slid into its notches at the top of the frame. The sound of wood meeting wood, a deep, hollow thud, carried through the stillness. The tension broke, replaced by cheers and laughter. Some men clasped hands. Others simply stood, shoulders heaving, staring up at what they had done. The builder wiped his brow, looked up at the finished frame, and smiled. "She's standing," he would say quietly. "She'll be here long after we're gone." Tradition demanded one final gesture, the topping out, A small branch, still green with leaves, was tied to the highest beam. It was both a blessing and a tribute to the forest that had provided the wood. As it fluttered gently in the afternoon wind, it seemed to bring the whole structure to life. A living house crowned by a living token. By late afternoon, the light turned soft and golden. The long shadows of the frame stretched across the ground. The air was filled with a kind of quiet joy, the calm that follows great exertion. Children played among the tools, pretending to hammer invisible nails. Women gathered the baskets, their laughter light and content. Someone started to play a fiddle, a slow, wistful tune that rose and fell like the wind through the trees. The men sat nearby, eating again, this time with satisfaction rather than hunger. The builder looked around at his friends, tired, dirty, smiling, and raised his cup. "To all who lifted her," he said, "and to all who will live beneath her." The simple words carried weight. They were met with a murmur of agreement and the clinking of mugs. As twilight descended, the scene softened further. The new frame stood dark against the fading sky, its outline sharp and proud. Fires were lit, their glow painting the beams in amber light. The day had been long, the labor immense, but the result was something close to sacred. In that moment, the house was not yet a house. There were no walls, no roof, no hearth. Yet everyone could feel its soul. Some lingered, unwilling to leave. They walked slowly around the frame, running their fingers along the smooth beams, marveling at the precision of the joints. The smell of fresh-cut wood was strong, rich, almost sweet. It mingled with the earthy scent of soil and the faint tang of sweat and smoke. For the settlers, it was the smell of creation itself. When the last fire burned low and the clearing fell into shadow, the frame remained visible against the starlit sky. It stood silent and steady, a testament to the day's unity. Those who passed by on their way home glanced back at it again and again, as if to make sure it was still there, as if they could hardly believe what they had built. That night, as families lay in their cabins, they could still feel the rhythm of the day, the pull of the ropes, the strain in their arms, the thud of beams meeting their places. In their dreams, the sounds of hammers and laughter mingled with the whisper of the forest. The memory of that shared labor lingered, comforting and humbling at once. Years later, when storms came and snow fell thick upon the roofs, when generations were born and buried beneath those beams, people would still remember the day the house was raised. They would point to a certain joint, a certain peg, and say, "Your grandfather drove that one." The stories would pass down like heirlooms, each telling polishing the memory a little brighter. Because the raising of the frame was not just a physical act, it was a declaration of belonging. It proved that the settlers were not merely visitors on borrowed land, but makers and keepers of it. The forest had offered its strength. They had answered with theirs. Together, they had made something that would last. And perhaps that was why, even centuries later, when wooden barns still stood weathered but proud in quiet valleys, the spirit of those first raisings could still be felt. Each creak of a beam, each groan of settling timber, carried the echo of that distant day, when neighbors pulled together and, for a moment, lifted not only a frame of wood, but the very idea of community into the light. When the frames stood tall and proud against the sky, the settlers knew the hardest work was still ahead. The skeleton of a home might rise in a single day, but the flesh of it, the walls, the roof, the small details that made it habitable, took weeks, even months, of patient effort. The open frame was a promise, but it needed skin, warmth, and protection. To keep out the cold, the rain, and the darkness, they had to build walls. Unlike stone, which stood immovable, or brick, which demanded kilns and mortar, the settlers had only the forest. Every wall they built came directly from the living trees that surrounded them. The same woods that had loomed as obstacles now became partners, offering both structure and shelter. Yet to turn wild timber into a wall that could withstand the seasons required more than muscle. It required understanding. Each wall began as a rhythm of stacking and fitting, a slow, deliberate choreography of human hands and wooden forms. The builders first chose their logs, straight, thick, and dry, felled weeks earlier so that the sap would drain away. The scent of resin hung heavy as they stripped the bark, revealing smooth surfaces pale as bone beneath. Every log was different, each one carrying its own twist, its own memory of growth. None could simply be placed as it was. Each had to be persuaded into alignment, coaxed into cooperation. The builders used axes, draw knives, and adzes to shape the logs into rough beams, flattening their top and bottom sides. The work was slow, methodical, and deeply satisfying. As the edges met and settled into place, the gaps between logs were small but inevitable. Through those cracks, wind and insects could slip in, and so the settlers learned the ancient craft of chinking. Chinking was both art and necessity, the careful sealing of every crevice with a mixture of local materials. In the forests of the Northeast, they used clay mixed with straw or horsehair. In wetter regions, they added moss, grass, or crushed shells to bind the mix together. The substance was packed by hand into the gaps, smoothed with wooden paddles, and left to harden in the sun. The result was imperfect but beautiful, a patchwork of color and texture, each wall bearing the marks of those who shaped it. Children often helped with the chinking, pressing handfuls of mud into gaps and laughing when it squished between their fingers. Mothers mixed the clay in large tubs, adding water until it reached the right consistency. The walls rose not only from skill but from shared effort. Every hand in the family left its print somewhere, a small, invisible signature on the house that would hold them through winter. As the walls climbed higher, the open frame gradually disappeared behind them. The wind that once moved freely through the beams now met resistance. The sound of the forest softened. Inside the forming rooms, the air grew stiller, quieter, warmer. It was the beginning of enclosure, the transformation of a structure into a space of belonging. Windows came next, though windows in those days were humble things. Glass was a luxury few could afford, often imported at great cost from distant cities. Most settlers used simpler means. They stretched greased paper or thin animal skins across small openings to let in light while keeping out drafts. The oiled paper glowed softly when sunlight struck it, casting a warm, golden hue inside. At night, it reflected the flicker of firelight, turning the cabin into a lantern in the dark woods. For those fortunate enough to acquire real glass panes, perhaps through trade or inheritance, their homes gleamed like treasures. A single small window pane could transform a room. Children would press their faces to the cool surface, amazed at how clearly they could see the outside world through it. Even the smallest shard of glass, when held to the light, was a symbol of refinement and hope, proof that civilization was slowly, quietly taking root. The doorways were simple, built from planks split and shaped by hand. Hinges, when available, were forged by local blacksmiths, but often settlers made do with wooden pivots or leather straps. The sound of a door opening for the first time, creaking softly, swinging on its pins, was always met with quiet pride. That sound meant privacy, safety, and home. As the walls closed in, attention turned to the floor. Some cabins had packed earth, swept smooth each morning with bundled twigs. Others raised their floors with boards cut by handsaws. The planks fitted roughly but firmly. The scent of sawdust mixed with smoke from the fires, creating an aroma that seemed to define the frontier. Half forest, half hearth. Building the hearth itself was an act of reverence. Stone was gathered from riverbeds and fields, carried by hand to form the base of the chimney. Mortar was rare, so builders used clay and sand, pressing each stone into place with patience. The fireplace was more than a place for warmth or cooking. It was the symbolic heart of the home. Around it, the settlers arranged their days and their dreams. Children learned to walk on its hearthstones. Elders warmed their hands there in the long nights. Once the walls were sealed and the roof laid, the transformation was complete. The open skeleton that once let the wind whistle through now contained stillness. The first time a fire was lit inside, The home took its first breath. Smoke curled upward through the chimney, carrying the scent of pine resin and burning bark. Outside, the forest absorbed the faint glow of the flames, as though acknowledging the newcomer among its shadows. Inside, the walls glowed with reflected light. The logs, though plain, caught the warmth of the fire and turned it golden. The uneven clay between them looked almost like sculpted stone, every ridge and line the record of a human touch. The sound of crackling wood filled the space, joined by the quiet rustle of people moving, the murmur of voices, and the soft sigh of relief that came from knowing they were safe. For the first time, the settlers could sleep without fear of rain seeping through the gaps, or frost creeping across their blankets. When storms howled outside, the walls groaned softly, bending but never breaking. The builders had learned how to make their homes breathe with the world rather than resist it. Each joint flexed, each peg held, each chink sealed the line between chaos and comfort. Outside, the forest watched silently. The cabins, small and humble, dotted the clearings like warm beacons. At night, their chimneys sent thin threads of smoke into the cold air. For travelers passing by, those faint signs of life were everything. They spoke of warmth, of food, of human company in the vast wilderness. As months passed, the walls darkened with age and smoke. The clay hardened to the color of dust. The logs deepened into shades of amber and brown. Inside, the walls gathered the scent of years, wood smoke, herbs, the faint sweetness of stored grain. The sounds changed too. The creak of a floorboard, the closing of a door, the rhythmic tapping of rain on the roof. The house became an instrument, each sound a note in the melody of daily life. In spring, when the snow melted and sunlight returned, families repaired their walls where the frost had cracked the chinking. Children helped scoop clay again, their laughter filling the yard. The cycle of care continued, just as trees shed bark and grew anew. The settlers understood that maintenance was not failure but relationship, a dialogue between builder and home, each tending to the other's endurance. Visitors who came to these early homes often remarked on their simplicity, yet inside, simplicity gave way to warmth. The walls might have been plain, but they were alive with light. Even a single candle could fill the room with comfort. The soft texture of the logs, the uneven clay seams, and the faint gleam of oil paper windows gave each interior a gentle beauty, unpolished, human, sincere. Sometimes, in the quiet hours after sunset, a settler might sit near the hearth, gazing at the walls. The flickering light traced the shapes of the wood, the knots and grains that had once belonged to trees standing deep in the forest. He might remember the sound of the axe striking, the creak of the ropes, the laughter of neighbors on the day the frame was raised. The walls around him were not just barriers, they were memories made solid. Each piece of wood held a story, of labor, of cooperation, of faith. The forest had given its strength, the people had given theirs. Together, they had built something that could endure both the fury of storms and the weight of time. In the hush of the night, the walls seemed almost to breathe, expanding and settling with the temperature, whispering softly in the language of wood and wind. Over the years, vines crept up the outer walls, and moss gathered along the lower logs. Birds nested beneath the eaves. The home and the wild became one. No longer opposing forces, but partners in survival. When snow blanketed the roof, the house looked as though it had grown directly from the earth, as natural and inevitable as the trees around it. And when the settlers walked through their doors after long days in the fields or forests, they always paused for a moment, listening. The sound inside was different from outside, calmer, gentler. The air smelled of smoke and bread, the faint tang of sap still lingering from the beams. That sound, that scent, that stillness, it was the meaning of home. For though the walls were made of wood and clay, they held something far greater, the spirit of endurance. Each line of grain was a memory of patience, each sealed gap a promise against despair. In the wilderness, where the nights were long and uncertain. These walls stood as quiet affirmations that human beings could carve safety from chaos, warmth from cold, and belonging from isolation. In time, these wooden houses would fade, their logs softening into the earth, their clay crumbling back to dust. Yet the idea they embodied, that harmony between nature and human craft could create beauty, would endure. Long after their builders were gone, the forest would reclaim the spaces, and grass would grow where hearths once glowed. But deep in the soil, the shapes of those old foundations would remain, silent but unforgotten, holding the memory of hands that once built walls from the wild. The roof was the last great trial, and in many ways it was the most sacred. Walls defined a home, but the roof made it whole. Until it was placed, the skies still entered freely. Rain, wind, snow, starlight. The frame might stand tall and the walls might hold strong, but without a roof there was no sense of safety, no true boundary between the wilderness and the world within. The settlers understood this intuitively. To raise a roof was to complete a covenant, a promise that what they built would shelter not only their bodies, but their hopes, their fears, and their faith in tomorrow. By the time the walls were ready, most of the settlers had already gathered the materials. They worked with what the forest offered: long, flat pieces of bark, split shingles of pine or cedar, or bundles of straw and reeds harvested from the marshes nearby. Nails, as always, were scarce, so they relied on cleverness and patience instead. They tied, wedged, or pegged their roofs into place, trusting the natural geometry of the beams more than any piece of iron. There were many kinds of roofs on the frontier, each born from its own landscape. In the northern forests, where cedar grew tall and straight, settlers split its trunks into thin wedges. These became shingles, light, fragrant, and resilient. When laid in overlapping rows, they formed a watertight barrier that shed rain like feathers. Further south, in regions rich with long grasses, roofs were thatched, woven by hand into thick mats. In the damp, rainy valleys, some used sheets of birch bark layered beneath poles, the pale bark gleaming in the sunlight like silver skin. But no matter the method, the feeling of completing a roof was universal. Relief mixed with quiet awe. The day the first piece was laid, the entire household seemed to hold its breath. Men climbed the rafters, balancing barefoot or in worn boots, carrying armfuls of shingles. Below, others handed them up one by one. The rhythm of the day was measured not by time but by progress, row after row rising toward the ridge. The scent of fresh wood filled the air, sharp and clean, mingling with the sweetness of pine sap warmed by the sun. Children often watched from the grass, shielding their eyes against the light. They could see the shapes of their fathers and brothers outlined against the sky, moving with slow precision. Sometimes a voice would call out, "Careful with that edge," or "Pass another bundle," and laughter would follow, easing the tension of the dangerous work. The women below prepared food and water, calling out now and then with encouragement. It was a day of effort, yes, but also of community, another step in the slow transformation of wilderness into home. By midday, the first slope would usually be finished. The builders would pause, sitting astride the rafters to eat and rest. From up there, they could see the world spread out. The glint of the nearby river, the dark line of the forest, the faint smoke rising from other cabins in the distance. It was a rare view, and for a moment, the land no longer seemed wild or threatening. It seemed possible, a place that could be known, tended, and loved. When the second slope was complete and the ridge sealed, the house changed. It was no longer open to the sky. The sound of the wind shifted. Inside, shadows softened. Light filtered through the gaps in gentle rays, warm and calm. The moment the last shingle was placed, someone always said the same thing. Quietly, as though afraid to disturb the peace. "It's done." That evening, the family would stand outside and look up. The roof, new and golden, shone faintly in the setting sun. It looked both fragile and strong, as though it had grown naturally from the walls below. And in a sense, it had. Every part of it, the beams, the shingles, the pegs, had been shaped by hand, joined by understanding and raised by faith. But the true meaning of the roof revealed itself only later, when the first rain came. The forest had a way of announcing storms long before the clouds arrived. The air would grow heavy, the light dimmer, the leaves whispering in a language older than human memory. Then came the wind, soft at first, then sharp. The settlers, hearing it through the trees, would look at one another and smile nervously. It was time for the roof's first test. The rain began with scattered drops, tapping gently on the fresh shingles. Inside the cabin, the sound was startlingly intimate. The family gathered around the hearth, listening as the patter grew into a steady rhythm. Water ran down the slopes of the roof, trickled along the edges, and dripped harmlessly onto the ground outside. Inside, not a drop fell. The logs remained dry, the air warm. Their house held firm. It was a feeling unlike any other. The deep, quiet comfort of being safe while the world outside wept. The settlers watched the firelight flicker on the wooden walls and felt something shift within them. For the first time, the wilderness seemed distant, less frightening. The roof overhead was thin, made only of wood and patience, yet it felt impenetrable. The sound of the rain became music, a lullaby sung by the forest itself. That night, the children fell asleep early, soothed by the rhythmic drumming above them. The parents sat silently for a long time, listening. "Do you hear that?" one might whisper. "It's holding," and the other would nod, their eyes reflecting the glow of the hearth. In that moment, the home was no longer just shelter. It was a promise fulfilled. As the weeks passed, the roof aged into its role. The bright new shingles darkened under sun and rain, their edges curling slightly, their scent deepening. Moss found its way into the crevices, softening the lines. Birds landed on the ridge and built nests beneath the eaves. In winter, snow piled thick upon it, creaking faintly under its weight, but never yielding. Each season left its mark: stains from smoke, scratches from branches, patches repaired by careful hands. And the roof grew more beautiful for it. Over time, the settlers came to understand that a roof was more than a cover. It was a mirror of the family beneath it. A well-kept roof meant diligence, care, and patience. A leaky one spoke of hardship or neglect. And so maintaining it became a quiet ritual, an act of devotion. Each spring, after the last frost, the men would climb up to inspect the shingles, replacing the ones that had split or warped. Children watched from below, their small faces turned upward, learning what it meant to tend and protect. Sometimes, during the long winters, when storms howled outside, the family would sit close to the fire and talk about the roof, how it was built, who had helped raise it, how it had held through the fiercest winds. The roof, like the hearth, became part of their stories. They spoke of it as though it were alive, a guardian, a companion. In truth, it was alive in its own quiet way. The wood expanded and contracted with the weather, creaked softly in the cold, and sighed under the heat of summer. At night, when the house settled, the rafters spoke in low groans and gentle pops, a kind of wooden breathing. To those inside, these sounds were reassuring. They meant that the home was still standing, still watching over them. And when spring returned, the sound of rain on the roof was no longer a test. It was a comfort. It became part of the rhythm of life, like the chirping of birds or the rustle of leaves. The settlers found peace in it. On quiet afternoons, mothers would sit by the window with their sewing, listening to the soft drumming above. Children played on the floor, building their own tiny houses from scraps of wood, their imaginations echoing the work of their parents. The house was alive with the music of creation, not grand, but human, intimate, enduring. Years later, when the builders grew old, they would sometimes step outside during rainstorms just to look at the roofs they had built. They would stand beneath the eaves, hands tucked into worn coats, watching the water flow off in silver sheets. The sound of it was steady and familiar, like the heartbeat of time. They knew the roofs would outlast them, that long after their own footsteps had faded, the houses would still stand, keeping others dry and warm. That thought brought them quiet pride. A roof, they often said, is the soul of a house. It shelters not only what lies beneath, but what it means to belong. It carries the weight of memory, of laughter and argument, of birth and death, of the endless cycles of days passing beneath its beams. Every stain, every nail, every shingle is a line in that story. When visitors came, traders, travelers, missionaries, they often remarked on how these wooden homes seemed to blend with the landscape rather than conquer it. The roofs, covered with bark or shingle, seemed to grow out of the trees themselves. They caught the light of morning, glowed amber at dusk, and disappeared gently into the night. It was as if the forest had chosen to lend its branches one last purpose: to shelter the very beings who had once feared it. As generations passed, many of these roofs collapsed and were rebuilt, their materials reused, their shapes evolving. Yet in every version, the spirit remained the same. The settlers, and their children after them, understood that to build a roof was to make a promise to the future, a statement that no matter how hard the world might become, there would always be a place of warmth and rest waiting beneath it. And even today, in the oldest surviving cabins, tucked away in forests, their walls silvered by time, those roofs still whisper the same story. When the wind moves through the trees and brushes across their shingles, you can almost hear the voices of those who built them, calling to one another through the centuries. Hold steady. Lift together. She'll stand fine because she did. And she still does. The roof was never just wood and labor. It was love, shaped into shelter, the final gentle gesture that turned a fragile human structure into a home. When the roof was finally in place and the first storms passed harmlessly overhead, the settlers discovered a new kind of silence, the silence of shelter. It was different from the stillness of the forest or the hush before dawn. This silence was alive. It waited, it listened, it invited. But inside that quiet, something was missing. The walls and roof provided safety, but not warmth. The house was a shell, strong yet cold. What it needed now was a heart, something that could turn protection into life. That heart was fire. The settlers had always known the value of flame. It had guided them across oceans, lit their nights, and guarded their camps. But within a home, fire was more than survival. It was identity. To kindle a hearth for the first time was to awaken the house itself, to give it breath and purpose. In that moment, the home became something more than timber and clay. It became a vessel for memory, emotion, and time. The first hearths were crude. Stone gathered from riverbeds was stacked in rough layers, held together by clay and ash. The settlers built the fireplaces wide and deep, often large enough for a grown man to step inside. At the back, they placed a flat stone to reflect heat outward. Above, they fashioned a chimney from mud and stone, or sometimes from wood plastered thickly with clay to prevent burning. It was imperfect work, smoky, uneven, prone to cracking, but it served. It held the fire where it belonged, at the center of the home. When the first flame was lit, it was almost ceremonial. Families gathered close, the air inside thick with anticipation. A father might kneel, striking flint against steel, coaxing a spark into the nest of dried moss and bark. The sound was small, a faint click, a whisper of friction, but the moment was monumental. The first wisp of smoke curled upward, pale and uncertain, before bursting into a fragile orange glow. The room brightened. The shadows drew back. The warmth spread slowly at first, hesitating as though testing its boundaries, and then filled the space with gentle insistence. The chill retreated from the corners. The damp smell of earth faded, and the cabin seemed to exhale. The crackle of burning pine echoed softly against the log walls, a language both ancient and new. Children's faces glowed in the shifting light, their eyes wide with wonder. For the first time, the house was truly alive. Firelight changed everything. It softened the edges of the world. It turned rough wood into gold and shadow into comfort. The flicker of flame on the walls transformed the small, simple cabin into something sacred, a sanctuary that felt larger than its size. Outside, the night pressed close, dark and infinite. Inside, there was warmth, safety, and the illusion that time had slowed. Around the hearth, life began to take shape. Meals were cooked in iron pots hung from wooden cranes that swung over the fire. The scent of boiling stew filled the room. Venison, cornmeal, herbs gathered from the forest. The fire roasted meat, baked bread, and dried the clothes soaked by rain. More than that, it gave rhythm to the day. Morning began when the embers were stirred back to life, and evening ended when the last coal faded to ash. Each home developed its own ritual of tending the fire. Some families kept a small ember burning through the night, banking it carefully beneath ashes so it could be revived come dawn. Others relied on neighbors if their flame went out, carrying a smoldering stick between homes cupped in a hollowed turnip or clay pot. To share fire was an intimate gesture, almost sacred, a sign of friendship and mutual reliance. In a world where cold could kill, warmth was a gift greater than gold. The hearth quickly became the center of existence. Children learned their lessons by its light. Letters were written beside it, prayers whispered before it. During long winters, when snow piled against the doors and the world outside was buried in silence, the family would gather close to the flames. The sound of crackling wood mingled with stories, tales from the old country, legends of saints and spirits, or simple recollections of the day's work. Fireside storytelling was more than entertainment. It was inheritance. Words spoken beside the hearth became part of the wood itself, absorbed by the walls like invisible carvings. The children who listened would someday tell the same stories to their own children, their voices carrying the same rhythms, their faces lit by the same glow. In this way, fire bound generations together, as surely as joinery bound the beams of their homes. The settlers soon discovered that every type of wood had its own personality in the fire. Pine burned bright and fast, spitting sparks like laughter. Oak burned slowly and steadily, giving deep heat that lasted through the night. Hickory snapped and hissed, but gave off a sweet, rich scent that filled the house. Maple glowed gently, its flames a calm yellow. They learned which woods to use for cooking, which for heat, and which for light. The sound of a log catching fire, the small pop, the sigh of flame meeting resin, became as familiar as a voice. On quiet evenings when work was done, the fire offered reflection. Men would sit staring into the coals, lost in thought. The flicker of the flames mirrored the flicker of memory. Brief, bright moments rising and falling, never to be held, but always to be felt. Some saw in the embers the faces of those left behind across the ocean. Others saw the future, the promise that their children would live in a world more secure than their own. Women found peace in its light, too. The glow of the hearth turned labor into ritual, spinning yarn, mending clothes, stirring soup, each task illuminated by gentle warmth. The firelight softened their weariness and turned ordinary moments into quiet acts of love. And for children, the hearth was magic. They saw dragons in the sparks, castles in the shadows, whole worlds rising and falling with the flames. The sound of the fire became the rhythm of their dreams. But the hearth was not only warmth and comfort. It was also discipline, even danger. Fire demanded respect. It had to be watched, tended, and fed properly. A neglected flame could die, plunging the house into cold darkness. A careless ember could leap and consume everything it had once protected. The settlers learned this the hard way. Stories spread of cabins lost to fire, of families left standing in the snow, their faces illuminated by the ruins of what had been home. So they developed rituals of care. Ashes were cleared each morning and spread thinly across the fields as fertilizer. Sparks were smothered before sleep. Buckets of water or sand stood always nearby. To tend the hearth was not merely a chore, it was an act of devotion, an agreement between fire and those who depended on it. In this way, fire became not just a presence within the home, but a teacher. It taught responsibility, awareness, and gratitude. It reminded the settlers that even the gentlest warmth was born of wildness, that every comfort carried a cost. Yet despite its danger, they could not live without it. And so they learned balance, the delicate art of coexistence. As the years passed, the hearth became the emotional center of community life. Guests were welcomed to its warmth. Neighbors shared stories before it after long days of work. When illness came, the sick were moved closer to it. When death came, candles burned beside it in mourning. Fire bore witness to all of it. Joy, grief, laughter, prayer. On winter nights, when the snow fell in thick silence, the world beyond the cabin disappeared entirely. The only sound was the slow crackle of logs. Outside, the trees bowed under the weight of frost. Inside, shadows danced gently on the walls. The flames reflected in every face, uniting them in the same golden light. That light became memory itself. Long after the fires went out, the scent of smoke lingered in the walls. Even when the cabins grew old and abandoned, travelers could still smell it. Faint, sweet, enduring. It was as if the spirit of those early fires refused to die, carried on the grain of the wood, preserved in the silence of empty rooms. In time, the hearth evolved. As tools improved, chimneys grew taller, stones fit tighter, fires burned cleaner. But the essence never changed. Wherever humans built walls and roofs, they built a place for fire, a center of warmth, reflection, and continuity. And perhaps that was the greatest gift the forest gave them. It provided not only the materials for their homes, but also the fuel for their hearts. Each fallen branch, each split log, each wisp of smoke rising into the air carried the same message, that even in the coldest world, warmth was possible. When the settlers sat before their fires, watching the flames curl upward into the darkness, they saw more than light. They saw the reflection of themselves. Fragile, flickering, yet capable of enduring, the fire whispered to them, reminding them that every spark of life, however small, could keep the night at bay. And when the last embers dimmed, glowing faintly in the ash, there was no fear, only trust. They knew that with morning it would rise again, because fire, like hope, never truly dies inside the walls that were built with love. The wooden homes that rose from the American wilderness were not static things. They were alive, in their own quiet way. Built from living trees, they carried the memory of forests within them, the rhythm of growth, the pattern of seasons, the pulse of life shaped by wind and rain. Even after being cut and joined, the wood did not forget. It breathed, it moved, it aged, and as years passed, each house began to live a life of its own, one measured not in minutes or months, but in the long, patient language of time. When the first spring came after a winter in a new home, the settlers noticed how the cabin changed. The air softened, and so did the wood. The walls seemed to ease, the beams expanding with warmth. The creaks that had once sounded sharp and brittle in the frost now mellowed into low, contented sighs. The scent of sap returned faintly, mingling with the fresh smell of soil thawing outside. Light poured through the windows, catching the fine dust in the air, and for the first time, the house seemed to glow from within. The families, too, shifted with the season. Doors were left open to the breeze, letting in the hum of insects and the smell of rain. Children ran in and out, tracking mud across the wooden floors, their laughter bouncing off the walls. Women hung washed clothes by the hearth, the steam rising gently into the beams. Men sat by the doorways in the evenings, carving new handles for tools, listening to the frogs calling in the distance. In those days, the cabin was more than a building. It was an instrument, resonating with the life around it. When wind moved through the trees, the house seemed to answer, its wooden joints creaking in sympathy. When rain fell on the roof, the sound was rhythmic, like a heartbeat. The house absorbed the world, and in return, It offered shelter, not by resisting nature, but by joining it. Summer was both blessing and burden. The woods grew dense, and the days were long and heavy with heat. Inside the cabin, the air grew warm and close, and the walls exhaled the scent of pine and resin. The settlers learned to read the mood of their homes, how the boards loosened slightly in the dry air, how the roof sighed as it expanded under the sun. Small gaps appeared between logs, letting in the faintest threads of light. The family stuffed these with moss and cloth, not out of annoyance, but with quiet understanding. A wooden house, like a body, stretched and shifted as it lived. During those months, the work was constant. Roofs were repaired, fences mended, the outer walls sealed again with fresh clay. The rhythm of life was measured in small acts of maintenance. Yet even the labor carried its own kind of peace. To patch a wall, to oil a hinge, to plane a rough board was to speak the language of care, the unspoken dialogue between human hands and the structure that held them safe. At dusk, when the heat faded and the first stars appeared, the cabins breathed out the day's warmth. Fireflies drifted past the windows. The sound of the forest swelled, cicadas, crickets, the rustle of leaves. The settlers would sit on the small porches they had built from leftover boards, watching the firelight flicker through the cracks in the walls. The air smelled of wood smoke, bread, and the faint sweetness of drying hay. These were the evenings when peace felt possible, fleeting, but enough. Then came autumn, and with it, the sound of change. The wind grew sharper, the trees blazed with color, and the homes prepared themselves for cold. Inside, people worked with renewed urgency. Logs were stacked high near the door. Windows were checked, cracks filled, the roof inspected for loose shingles. The cabin, which had relaxed in the summer heat, now drew itself tight, the wood contracting as the air dried. Every creak and pop of the beams seemed to speak a single truth. Winter is coming. Inside, the fire burned longer each day. The smell of smoke deepened in the air, clinging to clothes and hair, becoming part of the home's identity. The clay between the logs hardened again, sealing the warmth within. On stormy nights, when wind battered the roof and rain streaked down the walls, the family gathered close around the hearth, their faces glowing in the firelight. Outside, the world might rage, but inside there was steadiness, the house always holding. The first frost was always a quiet event. The air turned still and sharp, and in the morning, the window panes gleamed with delicate crystals. The walls groaned faintly as the cold tightened them. The sound was familiar by now, a reminder that the house, like its inhabitants, was bracing itself. Logs were brought in by the armful, and the fire was fed until the chimney sang softly with heat. Winter was when the relationship between house and family became most intimate. The walls no longer just enclosed, they embraced. Every sound, a board creaking, the fire crackling, footsteps crossing the floor, echoed through the small space. The family learned to read those sounds, to know when a door had swelled too tight, or when the wind was shifting direction. In that constant awareness, there was connection. The roof bore the weight of snow, bending gently but never breaking. Icicles hung from the eaves like glass ornaments, catching the pale sunlight. The inside of the house was dim and warm, filled with the smell of baking bread, drying herbs, and the faint tang of smoke. Time slowed. Work continued, mending clothes, carving tools, tending the fire. But it was quiet work, inward and reflective. Outside, the forest slept. Inside, the home dreamed. By late winter, when food stores ran low and the air grew thin with cold, the family drew closer together. They told stories of warmer times, of summer storms, of laughter under the open sky, of the day the house was built. These stories weren't simply distractions. They were sustenance, nourishment for the spirit. The walls seemed to listen, creaking gently as if in agreement. Then, as always, spring returned. Slowly at first, a trickle of water beneath the snow, a faint shift in the light. The cold loosened its grip, and the house, too, began to stir. The logs expanded again, the beams flexed, the joints breathed, the air filled with the scent of thawing earth. The home creaked, not from strain, but from renewal. It was as though the entire structure was stretching after a long sleep. The settlers opened the doors wide, letting the fresh air sweep through. Smoke stains were scrubbed from the hearth, broken pegs replaced, walls rechinked where frost had split the clay. It was a time of repair and gratitude. They understood that the home had endured, that the forest's gift, shaped by their hands, had carried them through yet another year. Some years were harder than others. Heavy rains might warp the wood, harsh winds might loosen the roof. There were seasons of illness, seasons of loss, seasons when laughter felt rare. Yet always the house remained, not untouched, but unbroken. Its strength came not from perfection, but from resilience. As the families aged, their homes aged with them. The once bright logs turned dark and smooth, polished by years of touch. The floorboards bore the marks of footsteps, soft hollows where children had played, deeper grooves where mothers had stood by the hearth. The walls carried faint stains from smoke and candlelight, a map of all the evenings spent in conversation and quiet. Even the smallest imperfections became cherished. A crack in the doorframe might recall a long-ago winter storm. A patched shingle on the roof might remind them of the summer a neighbor came to help. In these flaws, the settlers saw history, not failure, but proof of endurance. Sometimes, on quiet nights, they could hear the house itself moving. The wind would rise, and the beams would groan softly, a sound like breathing. The fire would flicker in response, and they would smile, whispering to one another, "She's just settling." It was a small phrase, but it carried great meaning. It meant the home was alive, adjusting to the world, still strong. When death came, as it always did, the house mourned too. The silence after a voice was gone felt heavier. The air seemed to hold memories in its grain. Yet even then, the home endured, carrying forward the echoes of laughter and prayer, of footsteps and song. Generations passed. New families took over old cabins, repairing, expanding, reshaping. Some added porches or new chimneys. Others built additions, joining one house to another. Still, beneath every change, the original spirit remained. That quiet conversation between wood and time. In the oldest homes still standing today, that spirit lingers. You can see it in the way the logs meet at the corners, tight and precise despite the centuries. You can smell it in the faint trace of smoke embedded in the wood. You can hear it in the low, patient sighs of the beams when the wind blows outside. These houses breathe. They remember the first hands that cut them, the first storms they endured, the first fires that warmed their rooms. They remember the songs sung beside the hearth, the stories whispered before sleep, the soft patter of rain on the roof. Each season left its mark upon them, and they wear those marks proudly, like rings within a tree, proof not of age alone, but of living. And so the wooden homes of early America became more than shelters. They became companions, witnesses, and teachers. They showed those who lived within them that endurance is not the absence of change, but harmony with it. They proved that even humble things, shaped with care and patience, can outlast the storms of time. Because a house made of wood does not fight the world. It moves with it. It bends, creaks, breathes, and holds. And in that quiet, unending motion lies the secret of its strength, and the story of those who built their lives within its walls. There comes a moment in every old wooden home when silence becomes the loudest sound, when the voices that once filled the rooms have faded, when the fires have long gone cold, and yet the walls still seem to whisper. If you stand quietly enough, if you listen between the creaks and sighs of the timbers, you can almost hear it, the slow echo of time, the pulse of lives once lived inside. That is the legacy of the wooden homes. They were never meant to last forever, and yet, in a way, they have. not in perfect form. Their beams have softened, their roofs have sagged, but in presence, they remain, as memory does, shaped not by what endures unchanged, but by what endures despite change. For centuries, they stood across the landscape of early America, in clearings and valleys, on hillsides and riverbanks. They were not monuments to power or wealth, but to endurance, humility, and belonging. Each one was born from the same simple bargain. The forest gave its strength, and in return, the people gave their care. The settlers who built them never imagined that their work would be remembered centuries later. They built for necessity, not for history. Yet what they created became history all the same. The walls they raised, the roofs they shaped, the hearths they kindled, all became the foundation of a nation's memory, not in marble and iron, but in wood and firelight. Over time, as generations passed, new materials replaced the old. Nails became common, sawmills multiplied, bricks and glass arrived in abundance. The age of the wooden cabin gave way to the age of towns and cities, of factories and railroads. Yet even as progress reshaped the world, something of those first homes remained. Their spirit lingered. In the warmth of a small fire, in the smell of pine, in the creak of a floorboard beneath tired feet. And whenever people built again, whether in timber or stone, in brick or steel, they carried a trace of that old understanding, that a home is not simply made, it is grown. It grows from effort, from patience, from the long conversation between human hands and the materials of the earth. If you travel today to the places where those early settlers lived, you can still find traces of them. In some valleys, a few cabins stand preserved, their logs darkened to silver gray, their joints tight even after centuries of wind. Moss clings to their foundations, and vines creep gently along their corners. Their roofs, patched and bowed, still catch the light at dawn. The air inside smells of dust and smoke, a scent so ancient it feels like memory itself. Step closer, and you can see the fingerprints of time, the axe marks still visible on the beams, the handmade pegs holding corners in place, the uneven chinking between the logs. These details speak of a different rhythm of life, one without haste, without machines, built by touch and trust alone. If you listen long enough inside one of these old homes, you might hear more than wind. You might hear echoes, the laughter of children, the low hum of a mother singing by the fire, the sound of an axe outside splitting wood. You might imagine a father repairing the roof after a storm, or a family gathered at the hearth during a blizzard, watching the sparks climb the chimney. None of it remains, and yet all of it does. Time, it seems, is kind to those who build with sincerity. The legacy of wooden homes lies not in their perfection, but in their imperfection, in the way they settled into the land, in how they changed with the seasons. They taught a quiet lesson that modern builders sometimes forget, that to create something lasting, one must first learn to listen. The settlers listened, to the sound of their tools, to the grain of the wood, to the sigh of the wind through the rafters. And in that listening, they found harmony. The forest, too, seemed to understand. For all the trees that were cut down, others rose in their place. The land healed, the roots spread, and over time, the balance returned. Nature, it seemed, respected the hands that treated it with reverence. The cabins that decayed eventually returned to the soil, their wood feeding new growth, completing a circle that had begun long before any human dreamed of a home. Historians often speak of progress, of technology, of industry, of the endless march toward efficiency. But the story of those first wooden homes is not a story of progress. It is a story of patience, of understanding that strength does not always come from force, and permanence does not always come from stone. Each home was an act of faith, not in materials, but in meaning. Faith that from rough hands and wild land, something gentle could emerge. Faith that shelter could be more than a wall against the world, that it could be a place where the human spirit found reflection and rest. And perhaps that is why, even now, the image of a wooden home still stirs something deep in us. We see a log cabin by a lake, smoke rising from its chimney, snow on its roof, and we feel a strange calm, as though we remember a life we've never lived. It is not nostalgia, but recognition. Something in us still knows that simplicity still hungers for it. The walls of wood, the sound of rain on a shingled roof, the glow of firelight on rough-hewn beams, these are not relics of the past. They are parts of what it means to be human. In a world that builds ever higher, ever faster, the old wooden homes remind us of what building once meant: connection, care, and the slow rhythm of creation. Each joint was cut by hand, each beam measured by eye, each wall raised by community. To build was to belong. The process mattered as much as the result. Even the tools they used, the axe, the chisel, the auger, carried stories. The marks they left behind on the wood were not flaws, but signatures. They spoke of labor, of fatigue, of quiet triumph. To run a hand along an old beam is to feel the pulse of that effort still lingering, like the warmth of a hand long after it has gone. And so, when modern travelers find themselves inside one of these old homes, when they breathe in the scent of aged wood and see the flicker of sunlight through the cracks, they are not merely looking at history. They are standing within continuity. They are standing in the same circle of creation that began when the first settlers built without nails, guided by nothing more than knowledge, patience, and hope. In the end, the legacy of wooden homes is not the wood itself. Wood rots, roofs fall, walls crumble. What remains is the spirit that shaped them, the belief that human beings can live with nature, not against it, that they can create strength through understanding, not through domination. It is a legacy that still breathes wherever craft and care meet, in the hands of a modern carpenter smoothing a board, in the creak of a farmhouse floor beneath morning footsteps, in the warmth of a cabin light seen through falling snow. Each of these moments is a quiet echo of that first act, when the settlers raised their walls and roofs and lit their first fires, believing that what they built would hold. And somehow, through centuries of wind and rain, it has. Because though the hands that built those homes are gone, their intention remains, woven into the fibers of the world. Their walls were not perfect, but they were honest. Their tools were few, but their care was infinite. And in the end, that is all it takes to build something worthy of remembrance. So when we speak of legacy, let it not be of monuments or cities. Let it be of small wooden homes in quiet valleys, homes that breathed with the forest, glowed with firelight, and endured through every season of time. They remind us that even the simplest acts, shaping wood, sealing a gap, lighting a fire, can be sacred if done with love. That what we build with our hands can outlast our lives, if built with our hearts as well. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of all, that somewhere in the silence of old timbers and the soft sigh of aged beams, the story of hope still hums, steady, gentle, eternal, like the heartbeat of the world itself.